Good evening or good morning, wherever you are in the world. I'm Samantha Joseph, and I'm moderating the first YouTube session of the 6th International Women's Day edition of our Read for Pixels campaign. So, through Read for Pixels, the Pixel Project is collaborating with 16 award-winning best-selling women writers to raise awareness about violence against women and to raise funds for the Pixel Project to keep our efforts to end violence against women alive and kicking, as well as help us to reveal the first mystery celebrity male role model portrait in our celebrity male role model Pixel Reveal campaign. We'll be telling you more about the Read for Pixels fundraiser, which has lots and lots of exclusive author goodies a little later in this session. And you can find out more about the Pixel Project at thepixelproject.net. So I've got a special guest.
Hello.
We have a very special guest today for our Read for Pixels discussion and Q&A session. It's the fabulous YA fantasy author Alwyn Hamilton, and she's here to help us kick off Read for Pixels. So Alwyn was born in Toronto and grew up in a small town in France before leaving to study history of art at King's College. She made use of her degree working for an auction house and now lives in London. Alwyn's New York Times best-selling debut, Rebel of the Sands, was published in 16 territories. And Alwyn was named the 2016 Goodreads Choice Award winner for the Best Debut Author. Her next book, The Notorious Virtues, releases in May 2020. Alwyn has generously donated some exclusive treats to the stash of author goodies we have out as personal donors at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. And she has some of the goodies with her right now. I'll just list them out. So there are 3 sets of the Rebel of the Sands book bundle, signed and personalized UK paperback editions for US and UK donors only, which consists of one edition of Rebel of the Sands, one of Traitor to the Throne, and one of Hero at the Fall. And there are 3 sets of Notorious Virtues sneak peek book bundles, signed and personalized, also for US and UK donors only. There's a special in it. There's a special preview of Alwyn's upcoming new book, Notorious Virtues, a hardcover edition of Throne, and a hardcover edition of Hero and Fall. There's also 3 sets of critique bundles by Alwyn, which is available worldwide. So this treat is the perfect opportunity for new authors to get some help from Alwyn for query letters, which are difficult to write at the best of times. The bundle includes 1 written critique of your query letter in mail to you, 1 written critique of the first 3 chapters of your book in progress, in pages back, 1 roundup of the 3 follow-up letters with Alwyn after she has sent you the critique. So there are only limited quantities of each letter goodie offered by Alwyn as a thank you treat to donors. So you guys had better hurry up to donate because it's first come, first served, and once they're gone, it's really gone. So please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project work to help and guidance in community. And if you're watching this session on YouTube right now, you will also be able to ask Alwyn questions live. Just make sure that you're logged into your YouTube account so that you can type your questions in the chat box to the right of the YouTube video. And Regina, who is today's producer and chat box operator, will relay them to read out to Alwyn to answer. So I'm going to pass it over to Alwyn, and she's going to do a short reading of one of her books.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I am really excited to be working with Read for Pixels for International Women's Day month, all of the things. So what I'm going to do to kick things off is read a little bit from the beginning of my debut novel, Rebel of the Sands. And I wanted to kick off with sort of something that really demonstrates the strength of the female character in this instance. So I'm going to start with chapter 1, pretty straightforward. So I'm going to read for about 5 minutes, and then hopefully we'll be able to chat a little bit more. So, chapter 1. They said the only folk who belonged in Deadshot After Dark were the ones who were up to no good. I wasn't up to no good. Then again, I wasn't exactly up to no bad, neither. I slid from Blue's saddle and tethered her to a post behind some bar called the Dusty Mouth. The kid sitting against the fence was sizing me up suspiciously. Or maybe that was just his 2 black eyes. I tugged the wide brim of my hat lower as I stepped out of the yard. I'd stolen the hat from my uncle, along with the horse. Well, borrowed, more like. Everything I owned belonged to my uncle anyway, according to law, down to the clothes on my back. The doors of the bar banged open, spilling out light and noise and a fat drunk with his arm around a pretty girl. My hand snapped to my shima before I could think better of it, checking it was still tightly fastened so the better part of my face was covered. I was wrapped up to my eyes, and even hours after sunset I was sweating out of the padding like a sinner at prayers. I figured I looked more like some lost nomad than a real sharpshooter, but so long as I didn't look like a girl, it didn't much matter. Tonight I was getting out of here with at least my life. All the better if I got out with a few coins in my pocket, too. It wasn't hard to spot the pistol pit on the other side of Deadshot. It was the noisiest building in town, and that wasn't saying nothing. A great big gutted-out barn at the end of the dusty street. It was swarming with bodies and blazing with light, propped up against a half-collapsed warehouse with a boarded-up door. Might be that once upon a time the barn had served some honest horse trader, but that was years ago by the look of things. The crowd thickened the closer I got, like buzzards swarming to a fresh carcass. A man with a bloody nose was pinned up against a wall by two others, while another drove his fist into the man's face over and over. A girl called out from a window with words that'd make an iron dragger blush. A group of factory workers, still in their uniforms, huddled around a nomad in a beaten-up wagon who was shouting about selling genie blood that grant good folks their heart's desire. His wide grin looked desperate in the oily lamplight, and no wonder. It had been years since anyone round these parts had seen a real live first being, let alone a genie. Besides, he should have known better than to think desert dwellers would believe gin bled anything other than pure fire, or that anyone in Deadshot would believe themselves good folk. Everybody in the last county went to prayers enough to know better on both counts. I tried to keep my eyes forwards, like I'd seen it all before. If I climbed past the buildings, I'd be able to look across the sand and scrub all the way home to Dustwalk, though there'd be nothing but dark houses. Dustwalk got up and went down with the sun. Good honest behavior didn't belong to the dark hours of the night. If it were possible to die of boredom, everyone in Dustwalk would be corpses in the sand. But Deadshot was alive and kicking. No one paid me much mind as I slid into the barn. A big crowd was already gathered in the pistol pit. Lines of huge oil lamps hung from the eaves, giving the gawkers' faces a greasy glow. Scrawny kids were setting up targets and dodging a big man's blows as he shouted at them to move faster. Orphans by the looks of them, likely kids whose fathers had worked in the hulking weapons factory on the outskirts of Dustwalk until they'd got blown to bits by faulty machinery, or until the day they'd gone to work drunk and burned themselves too badly to live. Gunpowder wasn't hardly safe work. I was so busy staring that I nearly walked straight into the giant of the man at the door. "Front or back?" he demanded, his hand resting carelessly on a scimitar on his left hip and a gun on his right. "What?" I remembered just in time to pitch my voice slower. I'd been practicing imitating my friend Tamid all week, but I still sounded like a boy instead of a man. The hired muscle at the door didn't seem to care. "It's 3 fuza to stand at the back, 5 to stand at the front. Betting starts at 10. "How much to stand in the middle?" Damn, I hadn't meant to say that. Aunt Farah had been trying to smack the smart mouth off me for a year now with no luck. I got the feeling it would hurt more if this man tried, but he just frowned like he thought I might be simple. "Front or back, there's no middle, boy." "I'm not here to watch," I said before I could lose the last of my nerve. "I'm here to shoot." "What are you doing wasting my time then? You want Hassan." He shoved me towards the heavyset man with billowing bright red trousers and a dark beard slicked to his chin, standing behind a low table piled with coins that bounced as he drummed his fingers. I took a deep breath through my shima and tried to look like my stomach wasn't trying to escape through my mouth. "How much to enter?" The scar on Hassan's lip made it look like it curled up in a sneer. 50 fuza. 50. That was almost everything I had. Everything I'd been saving up in the last year to escape to Isman, the capital of Meraji. Even with my face covered from the nose down, Hassan must have seen the hesitation. His attention was already wandering past me, like he figured I was about to walk away. That was what did it. I dropped the money on the table in a jangling handful of Lucy and half Lucy that I'd scrimped one by one over the past year. Aunt Farah always said I didn't seem to mind proving myself dumb if it meant proving someone else wrong. So maybe Aunt Farah was right. Hassan eyed the coins skeptically, but when he counted them with the speed of a professional money grubber, he couldn't deny it was all there. For a brief moment, the satisfaction tamped down on my nerves. He shoved a piece of wood at me that dangled from a loop of string like a pendant. The number 27 was painted in black on it. "Had much practice with a gun, 27? Hassan asked, as I put the string over my head. The tag bounced over the wraps I'd forced over my chest to flatten it. "Some." I hedged. We were wanting for almost everything in Dustwalk, in the whole last county for that matter. Food, water, clothes. There were only two things we had too much of: sand and guns. Hassan snorted. Then you ought to know enough to keep your hands from shaking. I pressed my hands close to my body to still them as I walked into the pit. If I couldn't hold a gun steady, it wouldn't much matter that I'd learned to aim before I learned to read. I lined up in the sand next to a man who looked like he was mostly bones under his grubby factory uniform. Another man came to stand on my other side with 28 around his thick neck. All around us the stands filled. The bet wrangler shouted at odds and numbers. If I were betting, I'd wager I didn't have any odds. No one in their right mind would put money on some skinny boy without the guts to even lower his shima and show his face. Maybe I could win some crazy drunk a poor man's fortune by proving the right-minded ones wrong. Good evening, gents. Hassan's voice carried over the crowd, quietening them down. Dozens of kids ran among us, handing out pistols. A girl with braids and bare feet passed me mine. The weight was instantly comforting in my palm. I quickly flipped open the chamber. There were 6 bullets neatly lined up. Everyone knows the rules, so you'd better play by them, or God help me, I'll break your cheating faces myself. A laugh erupted from the stands and a few whoops. Bottles were being passed around already, and men were pointing us in that way I knew from watching my uncle trade horses. Round 1, you got 6 bullets, 6 bottles. If you've got any bottles left at the end, you're out. First 10, line up. The rest of us stayed still as numbers 1 to 10 shuffled into place, their toes on a painted white line in the dirt. I judged about 12 feet between them and the bottles. A kid could make that. 2 men still managed to miss with their very first bullets. In the end, only half the men hit all their marks. One of them was twice the size of any other competitor. He was wearing what might once have been an army uniform, though it was too worn to tell for sure whether it used to be gleaming army gold or if it was just dirty with desert dust. He wore the number 1 painted in bold slash across the piece of wood on his chest. He got the biggest cheer of all. There were cries of, Damad, Damad, champion, as he turned away, grabbing one of the kids scurrying around to collect broken glass. Damad spoke too low for me to hear, then shoved the child off. The kid came back with a bottle of brown liquor. Damad started chugging, lounging against the bars that separated the pit from the stands. He wouldn't stay champion for long if he was going to wind up sloshed. The next round was even more dismal. Just one of the shooters hit all his targets. As the losers shuffled off, I got a clear view of the winner's face. Whatever I'd been expecting, this boy wasn't it. He wasn't from around here, no doubt about it. That was the first thing I noticed. Everybody around here was from around here. Nobody in their right mind would choose to be in the last county otherwise. He was young, maybe a few years older than I was, and dressed like one of us, wearing a green shima carelessly around his neck and desert clothes loose enough that it was hard to tell if he was really as broad as he seemed. His hair was black as any Merajan boy's. Even his skin was dark enough he might have passed for one of us, but he just wasn't. He had a strange, sharp features I'd never seen before, with high-angled cheekbones, a straight, square jaw, and eyebrows that made dark slashes above the uncanniest eyes I'd ever seen. He wasn't bad-looking either at that. A few of the men he'd beaten spat at his feet. The young foreigner's mouth pulled up in one corner, like he was trying to keep from laughing. Then, as if sensing my eyes on him, he glanced at me. I looked away fast. There were 11 of us left, and we were jostling for space along the line with an extra body, even with me being half the size of every man here. Move, 27. An elbow jammed into my side. My head shut up with a retort on my tongue. The retort died there as I recognized Fazim al-Motem sidling up next to me. I fought the urge to curse. Fazim had taught me every curse word I knew back when he was 8 and I was 6. When we were caught using them, I got my mouth scrubbed out with sand, and he blamed it all on me. Dustwalk was a small town. I'd known Fazim my whole life and hated him since I grew into some sense. These days he spent most of his time in my uncle's house, where I was stuck living too, trying to get his hands under my cousin Cher's clothes. Every so often he'd make a grab at a piece of me too, when Cher wasn't looking. What the hell was he doing here? Actually, with the gun on his hand, I could sort of figure. Damn it. It was one thing if I got myself spotted as a girl. It was a whole other thing if Fazim recognized me. And I'm going to pause there with still some pages left to go in chapter 1. But hopefully, if you enjoyed that, you'll want to read on, find out what happens in the shooting competition. And she takes away the prize and manages to get out of her dead-end desert town, which is basically what Rebel des Sands is about, or how it starts off. It's about a young female sharpshooter who's entering this contest because she's so desperate to get out of her desert town and winds up having things go a little bit awry and leaving on the run for her life instead. So yeah, thanks for listening to the reading.
Thank you so much for that reading from the Rebel of the Sands, Alwyn. It's an amazing story, and we have some questions about the trilogy, and especially about the women in them. So our first question, The Rebel of the Sands trilogy features some very strong women who come in different molds. There's the spunky runaway, the general's accomplished daughter, the frustrated female cousin. You've managed to give all of them an internal life that is rich and complex. So our first question related to that would be who or what were your inspirations for your female characters?
What were my inspiration for all my different female characters? Well, the inspiration for Amani was definitely some of the female heroines that I loved as a child growing up. I was probably first introduced to the concept of a girl needing to disguise herself as a boy in order to subvert the patriarchy by Tamora Pierce's Alana series, the Song of the Lioness Quartet, where a young girl named Alana is being sent off to become a lady, and her brother's being sent off to become a knight, and he has no interest in becoming a knight. She has no interest in becoming a lady. So she assumes her brother's identity and goes off and takes his place and becomes a badass lady knight, and sort of proves that if you give women a chance to do something, they can do it just as well as men. And then I also loved so many of the cross-dressing women in Shakespearean stories. I love Mulan. The Disney movie came out at just the right time when I was a kid. So I definitely was inspired by those women who, even though society is telling them that they are less than, they're like, no, we're not. Look, I'm good at this and I'm going to go do it, whether you say that I'm allowed to or not. And so I really wanted to sort of have that happen for Amani as well. Partly because also the story as a whole emerged because I saw a ridiculous argument happening online, which is happening again with The Witcher, about how female characters shouldn't be the action heroes in fantasy novels because they are, quote, too weak to lift swords, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. And if you think that the only weapon that anyone can have in a fantasy novel is a sword, you're very short-sighted. So I decided to write a female sharpshooter. I mean, she's got a bow there, but that's book 2, spoilers. So I decided to write a female sharpshooter. So that was a huge inspiration for Amani. For the other female characters, I kind of wanted them all to sort of express different things. So Shahzad, who's a lot of people's favorite, I think, who's a general's daughter, she's been raised almost completely differently than Amani was raised. She's been raised in privilege with a huge amount of money. She's got a father figure who doesn't put her down, doesn't hate her. So she's just come in with this huge amount of confidence and intelligence. And so I wanted to sort of contrast. Amani is a little bit of a blunt object. I like her a lot, but her solution to most things is like, blow it up, barge through it, shoot it. Whereas Shahzad is like, well, maybe let's figure this out and let's come up with a plan. So she's sort of a strategist and very clever. And it's actually extremely difficult to write a character who is so much smarter than you because I don't know anything about military strategy. And then I also, you see a little bit of Amani's cousin Shira in the first book. And Amani really looks down on her in the first book because she represents such a different type of girl than she is. She also has ambitions, but her ambitions are sort of money and power and these different things not to get out. And she is very manipulative and a little bit cruel in getting to them sometimes. And you only see her from the negative point of view in the first book. And then she comes back, spoiler alert, in the second book. I should start saying spoiler alert before I say the spoiler, shouldn't I? But she comes back in the second book and she sort of, Amani's kind of forced to re-examine her point of view of her and see that the things that she's done that Amani would maybe look down on are all survival ways for her. Not everyone survives with a gun and brute force. Shira has chosen to survive by being clever, by using her femininity and her sexuality a little bit, by kind of playing the political game in the harem, and all these women are sort of in that same boat. So a lot of women who she previously would have looked down upon, she's sort of forced to confront her own limited view of what people and women should be based on what she is. So I kind of wanted to present a wide range of different women because I think that is a huge thing for me in feminism, is that it's not just about being a badass female character for books, because I think a lot of the time we mistake that strong female character only means like Katniss or the girl with a gun or Rey in Star Wars, that these girls who kick ass, and that's definitely part of it. But I think strong female character just means well-developed female character with agency of her own. And so I wanted to have all these women with different forms of agency and different ways to get there. And you're not less of a strong female character if you're getting there by, fainting at a strategic moment in order to not get killed than you are if you're punching your way out of the room.
I agree with that. And I love that you provided readers with this range of female experiences. So, Rebel of the Sands, all of your female characters face a lot of sexism, especially as they're holding roles that historically and stereotypically have been held by men. And not only that, your story is set in a particularly misogynistic world. Was this on purpose to make the absurdity of sexism even more stark?
Yeah, I think it was. I mean, I always say when creating a world, it really bothers me when people default to things, to isms, because that's how they've traditionally seen them, or that's because how things were historically. So, I often use the example of people saying, well, I'm writing in a setting that's inspired by Tudor England, so obviously I couldn't have women have a strong role in it because women didn't at the time. So, it just wouldn't be realistic if I did it that way. And I'm like, sure, you're writing setting inspired by Tudor England, but also there's dragons. So I think if you can change that pretty big aspect from actual history, you can do whatever you want with the role of women or minorities or people of a different sexuality than straight, or all these things. And so choosing to default to it is absolutely a choice. However, that doesn't mean that you can't have these things as part of the story as long as they're a conscious choice rather than just Tudor times were sexist, so it's sexism. So I really wanted to, because, spoiler, no, not real spoiler, but Rebel of the Sands is about a rebellion. It's in the title. So I knew that Amani would be going into this rebellion, and a big part of her character arc is finding a cause that's greater than herself, because her motives at the beginning of the book are extremely selfish. She just wants to get out. She doesn't want to take anyone else with her. She's not trying to change the world. She's like, I'm going to get out. I'm going to fix my own life. Screw everyone else. And that sort of changes over the book as she learns to not be quite so selfish and not quite so self-absorbed. So something that I wanted to have was something that really affected her, but also affected lots of other people. And that was something for her to hang her hat on of like, oh, this is something I understand is bad. And if I join the rebellion and the revolution, then we can change this. And so that is where the society she's from, being particularly misogynistic, comes from, because this all comes from this leader, from the Sultan, who is misogynistic. There's other things that are problematic with his rule, but that's one of them. And so it's coming from the top down. And so when she meets this rebel prince whose take is women have an equal role in this rebellion, and I want everyone to help fight this war for me, then she's like, oh, well, this is someone who can actually change the world for the better, for something that does concern me and that you've seen concern her at the beginning of the book, which is the role that women are allowed to take in the society and expected to take in the society. So while I'm not like thinking that all fantasy books should have a sexist setting, I think I love to see some where it's just not even questioned, where women are also in the army, or women are, occupying roles of power, or the line of succession isn't necessarily male, and all these different things. In this case, it was a conscious choice. So for me, it's just always important that every choice you make in the book is conscious. And I think it is hard for choices to not be conscious when you spend so much time in a book. I mean, it would maybe only take you a few hours to read Rebel of the Sands, but it did take me a lot longer to write that. So I spent the probably, year and a half just writing it, thinking about all these things. So that's why I always encourage people who want to write these stories to really think about what it is representing for them and all the choices they're making rather than defaulting to tropes or stereotypes they've seen before.
As you just mentioned, one of the most exciting things about your trilogy is the fact that the action is almost entirely driven by the female characters, especially Amani and Chata. What was most refreshing about these women was the fight that they had in them every step of the way. No matter what perilous situation Amani finds herself in, she never gives up. And resilience is not often a virtue that is considered romantic or even womanly. You mentioned before that sometimes there are default characters or even tropes that people write about. Can you tell us what that means and what it's like to create characters that break away from that?
Sorry, could you just repeat the last part of the question? I just had a little bit of trouble hearing you with the sound.
Okay. You've mentioned
Just the last
part. Sometimes there are default characters that people write about, and can you tell us what those kind of default or trope characters mean and what it's like to create characters that break away from those kind of tropes?
Yeah, so trope characters are interesting because a lot of the time the reason that we have a trope or the reason we have a cliche is because they resonate in some way. We don't, there's like, I'll to sort of pick a lesser example, the trope of sort of, a line like something like his cloak was black as night. That's such a cliche line to say. But the reason that you see it in tons of books is because that immediately resonates. Everyone knows what night looks like. So you say something is black as night, and they're immediately like, oh, I get it. I get what I'm supposed to be seeing. And that's why it becomes an overused cliche. And that is the same, I think, for cliches in fantasy, in the larger scale of like cliches of character, because a lot of them are established by things like folk tales or medieval myths or whatever it is. So there's the trope of, if a character is particularly beautiful, they're good. Cinderella and her ugly stepsisters, beautiful Cinderella and her ugly stepsisters. Or, there's the trope of the knight and the damsel in distress. And I think that is sort of quite an interesting thing because, it immediately clicks. Like, I don't have to explain what the damsel in distress is. I say it and you're immediately picturing Rapunzel in her tower. You're picturing Princess Fiona from Shrek in her tower, whatever the case may be. But I think there's nothing wrong for me with using these tropes as long as no character, especially female character, is an accessory to a male character's plotline. I think that is the thing that I really want to see get resisted, especially in fantasy novels, because you don't want to see the damsel in distress just be the object of the male hero's quest, because in that case, like, she might as well not be a person. She might as well be an object. Like, I'm just as happy to watch a guy go on a quest for a magic sword as I am to watch him go on a quest to save a woman if the woman has absolutely no personality and is just a cardboard cutout. And so I think there's no reason you can't have a captured character, a damsel in distress, as long as she has real agency and you give her a bit of a backstory of her own, and think about her. And even if she doesn't have a point of view in the book or whatever the case may be, it'll come out on the page if you have thought about a character more than them being an accessory to plot or an accessory to another character. And that's often where I sometimes find frustration with my own writing or something spiraling out of control, because I'll think like, okay, I need a character here to do X thing. But then you can't just have sort of this character pop up and be like, and here's a riddle for the next part of your quest or whatever, and then pop out. That's a folktale thing. It's not a novel thing. So I kind of struggle sometimes with, this person pops on screen, on page for a few seconds to do something that I needed a character to do. But I've thought about them so much that they've then got this huge backstory. I'm like, well, the reason that they're the riddle giver is because they were obsessed with riddles as a child and blah, 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 which you don't have room for on the page all of the time. And you can't, get across without someone being like, let me tell you my story. Long monologue, especially if you're writing the first person, which Rebel is. But the nice thing is at the moment I'm writing Notorious Virtues, which is 4 points of view. So that's been something really nice of getting to delve into these characters, especially because Notorious Virtues is based on the trope of sort of the fairy tale quest for like the MacGuffin, the magic object. And so I wanted to make sure everyone was really fleshed out. And that's something that's a lot easier to do when you've got multiple points of view.
So your stories center strong female friendships and female kinship, which usually are relationships that are sidelined in favor of romance, including the annoyingly persistent love triangle trope. What can you suggest for writers who want to write female conversations and relationships realistically?
Something interesting that I sort of thought when I was writing Rebel of the Sands, I had a lot of plot beats mapped out before I got to them. And I think the important thing that I would always tell writers is like, obviously know where you're going, but don't be too attached to plot beats because they might change when you get there. So you have to be able to like let things go. And one of the ones that I had to let go was and this is a terrible example of defaulting to a trope, that I sort of figured, I knew that this is going to be a spoiler for Rebel of the Sands, bear with me. I knew that when Amani and Jin got to the rebel camp and she discovered that he'd been keeping from her for the first half of the book, that he was part of the Princess Rebellion, there would be some conflict there and there would be some anger from her towards him. And I initially imagine that Shahzad would also get caught up in this conflict. Shahzad is the other sort of main female character in the rebellion, the general's daughter, and so I envisioned that that some of the anger that she had towards Jin would get directed towards Shahzad as well, because she thought she'd gotten to know him really well along the road, and here's someone who's known him even better. And I tried writing that a couple of times and it just didn't work. It just seemed so petty and forced and boring to just default to, here's a new woman in the storyline. Let's default to them being frenemies. Let's have women not get along. And I was just like, why can't they just get along? Because that is such a trope of like female rivalry, especially over a boy, even if Shahzad isn't part of this love triangle. There's no love triangle. Even if she isn't part of the love triangle, there's still conflict between women in books so often. And so I completely let that go and just had it be that when Amani arrives in the rebel camp, Shahzad kind of looks at her and is like, listen, you seem like a badass girl. I'm a badass girl. Should we just get it over with and be best friends? And she's kind of like, yeah, okay. So even though Amani hasn't had much experience with female friendships up to that point, it felt so much more natural to just have them recognize each other's strength and badassness and become best friends rather than become enemies, because it's just so tedious to have them in conflict over essentially a boy, even if it's not romantic. And so that kept sort of coming up. I found a lot of especially because I didn't want there to be a love triangle in Rebel of the Sands, there's not a ton of conflict. There's some conflict, but there isn't, for me, there wasn't any doubt that Amani and Jin were ever going to wind up together. They have this relationship. It lasts in various peaks and troughs over the course of the 3 books. So a lot of the relationships that were more complicated and did have this sort of tension were outside of the romantic relationship that's at the center of the book. So it's, on Jin's side, it's his relationship with his brother is very fraught. On Amani's side, her relationship with Shahzad is very like soulmate girls. And then there's a relationship with her cousin and the women in the harem that evolves in a more interesting way. And so I just didn't find it interesting to have women in conflict. I find it so much more interesting to have them team up. And that's something I always love to see on any movie or TV show. Like I love the team coming together moments. I rewatched the first Avengers movie on the plane recently, and I just love that scene when they all come together to fix the sort of space in the sky thing. And so that was sort of what that represented of when she comes into the rebellion, of it being like, right, we're all coming together as the rebellion now.
Our next question is actually from a YouTube viewer. Her name is Julia, and her question for you is, Hi Alwyn, love from Italy. Would you like to write a fantasy book set in Italy? And which are your favorite badass heroines?
Hi, Julia. I think I know which Julia this is. I think we've met in Italy. But I would love to write a book set in Italy or a fantasy version of Italy. So the book I wrote, I've talked about this before, but Rebel of the Sands is the sixth complete book that I wrote. I wrote, or maybe it's a seventh. I wrote 6 books before Rebel of the Sands that didn't work in some form or another, but were practice books. I learned so much from writing them. They were not wasted time in any way, shape, or form. But the one I wrote right before Rebel of the Sands was what I call the almost book. It was almost good enough that I think it could have been the book I submitted for publication, but it was missing something, and that something came when I wrote Rebel. But that book was actually set in sort of a fantasy version of Venice. So Venice has always been my favorite city in the world. I just love it so much because there's very little that's new there. You can't really expand. I mean, there's a lot of old stuff in London, but there's also a lot of new buildings. Venice is pretty much universally old on the middle, apart from the shop fact that there's electricity and ice cream stores. But so I always found it such a fascinating city. And I also like that Venice is kind of twisty turny, and you never know what you might find around a corner. Like you can find yourself going down the smallest, weirdest, dead-endest alley. And then you turn out and there's a huge, beautiful church right in front of you. And so I really would love to use that as a setting sometime. And I think I could probably salvage the book that was the almost book now with everything that I've learned from writing Rebel of the Sands. I could make that book work. It would need to be, a bunch of things would need to change. It would need to be multiple point of view. The plot would probably need to be kind of like the basic plot could stay the same, but a lot of the stuff that actually happens would need to be rejigged. So I don't think I could probably use maybe more than 4 pages of what is currently in my Word document of that old book. But the thing that I know that would stay the same is that it would feel very much probably like a fantasy version of Venice, because a big part of it was the setting and was that it's it's a shipping port that's very in demand by these sort of various competing powers, but also the kind of opening scene of the book and the inciting incident of the book is that the main character's sister is found murdered on a bridge that divides right between the place in the city that's divided up between one faction and another faction. And so it's trying to figure out, it's kind of a murder mystery in that way, but her death kind of sparks this conflict between these two factions, and she's literally on the bridge right in the middle of them. And that is a very, I think, Venice-centric image of this kind of city of many bridges. And listen, if someone wanted to pay me to live in Venice for a while and write a book, I'd be okay with that.
Wouldn't we all, though? Julia also wanted to know if you have a favorite badass heroine.
Oh, a favorite badass heroine. Well, I've mentioned one already, which is Alana from the Song of the Lioness Quartet by Tamora Pierce, which I highly recommend checking out if you haven't already. I do not know if it's translated into Italian. But another huge one for me would be Harry Mad Soul from the Blue Sword by Robin McKinley. And she is basically, it's set in desert. And she's basically a character who is sort of has magic belonging to the desert people, even though she's not from the desert people, and gets abducted and brought to train sort of with them. And so she is the first character that I ever remember reading on the page and thinking, I want to be like her, because there's a specific scene in it where it's from another character's point of view, and she's sort of, she's just been abducted in her nightdress and she's been whisked away and she doesn't know what's going on. From her point of view, she's being kidnapped for horrible reasons, even though it turns out to not be for horrible reasons. and she's sort of standing very tall, and another character whose point of view you're in at that point remarks, oh, I never knew that the non-desert people raised them to be so proud and so strong and so steel-backed. And I just remember, like, I would be a mess, thinking, if I were that kidnapped person, I'd be crying in a ball on the floor. I'd be a mess. I'd be wailing. I wouldn't comport myself with that kind of dignity. And I remember reading that as a child and thinking, I want to have as much dignity and as much sort of panache as her. So that's another great one, is The Blue Sword by Robin McKinley, and the prequel sequel to it. It's kind of hard to explain. It's sort of in the same world. By her is The Hero and the Crown, and I also loved the main character from that, who is a badass dragon slayer.
Okay, next question is actually a general discussion about relationships in SF novels. So the line between consent and coercion isn't always very clear in fantasy books, whether it's epic fantasy, urban fantasy, or paranormal romance. Do you think this is an issue that writers in the genre have started to tackle successfully in recent years?
I think consent in general is something that we've become more aware of. I think there used to be, even when I was growing up, I don't think there was a conversation around that sort of thing. And everyone used to think of sort of sexual assault as sort of tied down in an alley, like, these violent things. And now we know that it's a much more complex issue. I remember very specifically actually listening to a podcast about, and I'm going to blank on her name, but it's, I want to say it's like Barbara Hutton. I can't quite remember her name, but she's a Hollywood actress who was tragically murdered by her ex-boyfriend, and at one point claimed sexual assault against Hugh Hefner, and was sort of mocked for it because he said, oh, I'm Hugh Hefner. Why would I need to assault someone? I can get any woman I want. And that just, that just shows how limited, even sort of in the 80s, our understanding of what assault was at the time. Lack of verb. And I think, and it's much evolved now, because obviously now we know, all these different things about what that means and about what silence means or doesn't mean, or, all these things with the trials that are happening currently. And yet there's still people, well, if you dress like that, it's consent, and all these stupid conversations. And so, well, I don't think we need to go as far in fantasy books and sci-fi books as, having someone literally always say yes in these situations. I think that can take out some of the sort of narrative smoothness of things. I think that it is important for, it not to be like I'm overpowering, but she wants it. Scenes need to sort of kind of tone down. And that's something you often find in older fantasy, I think, where men are sort of the powerful, what's the word I'm looking for? Like action heroes, and women are the damsels in distress, or whatever it may be. I was even watching Indiana Jones the other night, and I'm like a bit like, ooh, this is a tiny bit iffy at points. And I love that movie, but we've kind of just got to take a step back sometimes.
Do you think that reframing how stories describe men, moving away from hostile and toxic stereotypes of masculinity and towards complexity and even vulnerability, can be one of the ways science fiction and fantasy writers can break away from toxic tropes that promote toxic masculinity and even the dehumanization of women?
Yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with a masculine character. I think much like with female characters, what's important with any genre or any writing is that there not just be one type of anything in your book. It's why, like on Brooklyn Nine-Nine, for instance, to pick a TV show, I love the fact that there's two Latina women on it who are completely different. One's a badass, killer, and one's a very straight-laced, like studious person. And so that promotes this idea of, oh, there isn't just one type of what being a Latina woman is in this world. And I think that is the same for fantasy novels of, if all of your men are Conan the Barbarian, then that's what you're saying sort of men are and what masculinity should be. You can absolutely have a Conan the Barbarian character as long as there's like a couple of other men in the book who are maybe not just brute force and that kind of characterization. And also, how positively do you present it? Are you presenting, Conan the Barbarian as good and what you should absolutely aspire to be, and sort of the more soft, less aggressively masculine characters as laughable or jokes, then that might be a problem. And it's the same with women. You can absolutely have, a damsel in distress in your book, as long as that's not every single woman that I see is a damsel in distress. And so I think it's not about removing all traces of this trope. I think it's about having a balance and how you address it. I recently read over Christmas all 8 of the Bridgerton novels, which are Regency romance. And of course, they're going to have a very kind of, their romance books are going to have a very masculine point of view on things. Sorry, my Siri just woke up at the sign of Regency romance. But, they all have their own things going on. They have all got their own inner lives. So even though it's 8 quite masculine men, they all have different, backstories and interests in various things. And so I think it's about sort of diversifying what men mean, as well as questioning the toxicity of the masculinity, which is especially noticeable if it's on its own. Because, I don't, love me some Terminator, but I don't want to watch, Conan the Barbarian just blunt force around and that be the only thing that's presented as positive in those books or movies.
Stories are one of the most powerful ways of bringing about cultural change. So in your opinion, how can authors strike a balance in their storytelling between raising awareness about violence against women while also telling an engaging story without being pedantic or preachy?
I think everyone always knows when they're being preached to. I think that's a real, especially teenagers. Teenagers who are smart, they will immediately put something down if if we're trying to teach them a lesson or preach to. I'm also not especially interested in writing about things that are a moralistic take or are a clear-cut answer. I'm much more interested in writing about things that are big questions. So for me, is there violence against women? Yes, that's not a question. Whether you're choosing to include it in your work, it depends on how you're addressing it, obviously. Coming back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier, I think it's a hugely problematic thing when you see it presented as like a violence against a female character as an incentive for a male character to do something. So it's the, my wife was murdered, and so therefore I'm going on this revenge thing. Or my daughter was kidnapped, and therefore I'm going to go kill everyone. Not that, Taken isn't a fun movie, but, I couldn't tell you anything about the daughter in that movie, which is unfortunate. Lots about Liam Neeson as he lectures on the phone, but nothing about the daughter. So I think it's a case of not utilizing it gratuitously as a look how bad this character is, he's beating up women. It's a case of not using it gratuitously graphically when it might do more harm than good. It's a certain, like, how much do you actually need to show that it's bad versus that you're showing gratuitously because it's, it sort of expands the violence. And also what the tool of it in the story is. And I think it can absolutely be useful, especially in contemporaneous settings, actually, where it's a question of, why women don't come forward about violence earlier, or how it's so systemic, how the cycle of violence continues. All of those are more interesting questions to me than do women get assaulted? And it's like, yes, but do that, yes, kind of thing. So I think it's about presenting it in a very careful way because not everyone is that educated about it. And some people are going to be more harmed by a particularly graphic depiction of it than educated. And so I think it's again questioning what your motives are for including it in the story. I thought, for instance, the Mad Max Fury Road movie, which stressed me out to no end, did a great job of us understanding that these women were fleeing an abusive situation without needing to show Immortan Joe, the villain of the movie, beating these women to a pulp or raping them on screen. I was very happy that we didn't have to watch a scene of that, but we completely understood as they fled with Charlize Theron that they were fleeing an incredibly bad abusive situation.
For our next question, it's from one of our viewers. Vanessa, or her YouTube name Namika X Ichigo, says, "Hi Alwyn, I recently finished the Rebel of the Sands trilogy, and I absolutely love Amani and this desert world. Are you considering ever telling another story in this setting?"
Ooh, well, have I considered telling another story in the setting? So if by the setting you mean the desert, I don't currently have any plans to return and write a whole book in the desert anytime soon. If you mean this setting by the world, then yes, I have considered it. Just drifting this across the screen. So my next book is The Notorious Virtues. And it is not set in the desert, but it is set in the same world as Rebel of the Sands. So something that I really enjoyed doing in Rebel was building hints of the outside world of Rebel. So, you know, the desert, the whole book happens in the desert, but there's hints of this person is from this other country, this person is from this other country, this is imported from here, because I don't want it to be an isolated country. So one of the countries that's mentioned as being quite technologically advanced is the setting for The Notorious Virtues. And there isn't a huge connection to Rebel of the Sands, but there is one of the characters at the end of Hero at the Fall who is still alive, is the grandmother of one of the main points of view characters from Notorious Virtues. And I've really enjoyed writing her granddaughter. So I don't think I'll necessarily come back to the desert in the next few books, but I really loved getting to talk more about the world as a whole and shape what magic looks like in other places. And also, the grandmother of the main character in this is, I think, someone who is universally hated by the end of Hero at the Fall. A friend of mine referred to her as a quote-unquote cockroach, which is fair. But her granddaughter is maybe one of my favorite characters I've written. So it's really interesting sort of seeing how that changes across the generations.
I'm really looking forward to that. Next question is about geek culture. And so geek culture and fandoms in general has had its share of critics because they say that it's still too male dominated despite a rising number of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors. Not only that,
I'm so sorry. I'm having such a hard time hearing you, Sam. I'm sorry. The sound's gone funny again.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you so much better now. Thank you.
Okay, I'll just read this.
Sorry.
So geek culture and fandom in general has had its share of critics, saying that it's still too male dominated, despite the fact that there's a lot of prominent, well-respected, and well-known female authors. At the same time, there's a lot of hostile, misogynist, and sexist behavior by male fans and male geeks towards the female. So what do you think needs to be done to make geek culture as a whole, whether it's comics or gaming or books, more welcoming for females, for women and girls?
Oh, I mean, I wish I had the solution to that, to how to make geek culture more welcoming to women. I think one of the great things about young adult is that, including fantasy, is that unlike adult fantasy, it is, in my experience, largely dominated by women. Most of the writers that I have met in the YA sphere are female. Most of the writers I read on a regular basis in young adult are women. There's a few exceptions, but I think it is a very female-dominated age group to write for, which is really nice. And I think part of that reason probably is because when young adult was coming up, women didn't necessarily feel that welcome in adult fantasy all of the time. So I think what we've done in a way is sort of find our own niche within geek culture in which we feel safe, and feel like we're not constantly under attack for, prove that you're enough of a geek of this and blah, 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 blah. But because I thought that's something I find exhausting, is having to validate your geek credentials for admission or whatever the case may be. But I think, it's difficult to say, because of course we want it to get better, but at the same time, is it something that you want to be part of if it is so against you? So I think I find it quite tricky in a lot of cases. And I think there are people working to change it. I think the nice thing is that there's female fantasy authors who came from YA who are writing for more adults now, like the Bardugo's Ninth House series is adult, but she came from YA. Or there's people who are reading YA who are young women who are growing up and looking for more women in adult fantasy, and hopefully finding people like Samantha Shannon's Priory of the Orange Tree. And that will encourage there to be a bigger place for women in writing, at least if there's an appetite created for it. The conversations you see are so exhausting that I sometimes have trouble carrying or taking part in them, because it'll be like, I don't know, you're wrong about this, rather than we can have a different opinion about books, which I find tiring. I think it'll probably take a while to shift, because the canon is so male dominated in adults, especially. I would struggle to name more than a handful of female adult authors before, in the last century. I think it's getting better in the 21st century. And so when we don't have someone to look at and say, oh, they're doing it, so therefore I can do it, I think that makes things a lot more difficult. But I think as more women are doing it, more young girls are thinking, oh, it's something that women can do, is be part of the fantasy space, whether that's as a writer or as a fan. And I think there's lots of awesome women sort of encouraging that and supporting that. And a series that I really like on YouTube, which is very geek space central, is Actually, which College Humor does, which is basically a show that highlights the, quote, most annoying part of geek culture, which is like, prove that you know the most about this. It doesn't matter what you have to say. Their tagline is, it doesn't matter what you have to say, all that matters is that I know more than you. And it's sort of a send up of this negative part of geek culture of, me saying something slightly wrong, then being like, actually, you clearly know nothing because this and this and this. And they're really good about including, smart women on it, and men who are respectful of these women's space in geek culture. And I think that represents a shift towards, at least an acknowledgement that it hasn't always been great in the past, and that we're maybe hopefully moving towards fixing it.
I'm so sorry, everyone, for the sound issues. It's a bit of a tech problem, and I'm really thankful everyone's been very patient, and thank you, Alwyn, for your amazing answers. So our next question is going to be a reviewer question, and it's from Sadie. So she asked, talking about all those powerful topics, are there more topics very dear to your heart that you haven't wrote about yet, but you'd love to?
I'm so sorry, I had trouble hearing you. Oh, there it is. It's come up on the screen. Let me just read it. Topics that I haven't written about yet that I would like to. Interesting question. I think I have very rarely gone into a book thinking, here's a topic that I want to write about. And because I think when you go in with a topic instead of a story, it's much more difficult to write. I think it can be, you can get mired in themes rather than in storytelling. I didn't figure out what the themes and topics of Rebel of the Sands were pretty much until I'd finished writing it. I just thought it was going to be an exciting action story about a girl crossing the desert and a rebellion. And then as I got into it, I realized it was about sort of selfishness versus selflessness, about what, it means to subvert power, or when you should be subverting power, or when, you're right or wrong, or what the difference between rebellion and terrorism is, and all these different things that I discovered as I was writing them. Something that I think you'll find in the Notorious Virtues that is maybe a theme that I went in consciously with, is about what virtue looks like, and whether virtue is like the things that we signal as virtues are always good. For instance, you can be a very nasty, brave person, or you can be a very malicious, intelligent person. Bravery and intelligence are both virtues, versus what it means to be a good person. That's something that's sort of explored, and spoiler alert on the title, that's explored in this, which was not necessarily something I consciously knew going into it that I wanted to write about, but kind of came out as I was writing. Something I would love to write more about. Interesting. I think there's a little bit of it in Notorious. I think I'd probably like to see some stuff about sort of body image and things like that in fantasy, because often, talking about stereotypes, there is often a stereotypical form in fantasy that characters are always sort of fit and skinny and things like that. And I did that in Rebel of the Sands, but that's because it didn't make sense for someone to walk across a whole desert and not be that physique. But it's something I'd like to be more conscious of in future books I write. An excellent book for that is Ray Carson's trilogy, where she has a more plus-sized princess who is the sort of chosen one in the books, which is really great. So I think sort of things that are often explored in contemporary novels would be nice to bring into to fantasy sometime. Other than that, sorry, that was my computer pinging. Other than that, I think I'll know it when I see it. But what I'd really like to write sometime probably is a multiple point of view book, one point of view which believes itself to be the hero and the other person the villain, and vice versa. I'd like to write a book where you don't know which side to be on at some point, because that's something that I find really interesting. Of people are always the heroes of their own story and believe themselves to be in the right, and you believe whoever's point of view you're put in to be in the right, and so I'd like to see what it looks like if I put people in both points of view. And I think that might be the shape that if I ever end up getting back to it, the Venice book that I talked about earlier would probably take.
So we come to our final question. You have been so very incredibly supportive of our Read for Pixels campaign and our anti-violence against women work as a whole. So would you like to tell us why you support the cause to end violence against women?
For me, it seems like an obvious thing that shouldn't be happening anymore. It seems like we should be, as naive as this might be to sound to say, it seems like we should have moved past this by now. To some extent, I also feel like we should have moved past war by now and all violence, because especially as it gets worse and as we have less of a medieval mindset. But we haven't. And even with the all the resources and information and everything that we have around it, it's still an incredibly pervasive problem. And again, maybe this sounds naive, but I still find myself incredibly shocked every time something like this goes on to the point that it becomes, it becomes more serious and leads to death, or, things that, not that violence itself isn't serious, but you know what I mean. And I find that we're always surprised as a culture when it happens. There was that issue very recently with Melissa Benoit, who plays Supergirl on TV, and spoke out about the fact that she had been being abused by her, I think, boyfriend or husband, I can't quite remember, for multiple years while she was filming this series. And I think it shocked everyone because she literally represents Supergirl, and Supergirl was being abused. And then had gone on a talk show and covered for it. Literally, that she went on and had a bruise, and she'd said, "Oh, it was my dog," and they didn't even ask her about it. She just volunteered this information, and the extent that even that someone with the resources to leave and all these other things gets caught up in these horrible situations. And I also listen to a lot of true crime where you see these horrible situations turn into death and murder, which is very, obviously there's no coming back from that. And it shocks me every single time I hear, I'm like, how did it get this far? And I would love to get to the point where there's not these shocking things happening, where I have nothing to be shocked about anymore, because the situation was, this happened once, she left, the resources were in place to keep him away from her, and that was the end of the story. Not say it happened and then it happened again and then it happened again and over again, which is more usually the story. So I just find with our awareness of it that the awareness is only the first step. It's, the first step is admitting you have a problem. The second step is doing something about it. And I just don't feel that we're still, even with the awareness, doing enough about it, except being shocked when it happens.
What do you think influential authors such as yourself can do to help with the cultural change needed to eradicate violence against women and girls?
What can authors do? I mean, we can help raise money, like in this situation. We're asking people to donate, to support this cause. I think also we can sort of very clearly, as awful as this is going to sound, I think female authors can do a lot for women. I think for the point of view of men, a lot of the times it needs to come from their influences, which oftentimes are male. So if we have fewer male authors representing violence against women or glamorizing it in any way as, oh, it's violence against women, he goes and avenges her or whatever, then that would be great. I think what we can do is represent situations that don't escalate to the point that it becomes horrible and awful and it's a terrible headline. Situations where, someone does the thing that we all wish would happen and is able to leave and end it in the immediacy, setting positive role models, positive examples. But I'm also going to say that no one is judging these situations, because it's impossible to judge something that you're not directly in. So I would never say, I'm judging you if you're not as much of a badass as Amani or as Katniss or whatever, because obviously when you're not in that situation, it's very easy to say these things. So I think trying to sort of have empathy and be somewhere to go and somewhere to retreat to, and a positive example can hopefully go some way towards changing things in the long term. But I do think it's a long-term systemic issue, and it is different in all parts of the world. Probably different things need to be done to resolve it in Europe, as in America, as in Asia, as in Africa, as in wherever else. So South America. So I think it is a worldwide problem that probably has different solutions depending on the culture.
Thank you for your really well thought out answer. That's actually the last question from us. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and thank Alwyn as well for answering all of our questions. So what's going to happen is I'm going to put myself on screen with Alwyn and talk about her goodie bags again, and she can go over them as well. So
welcome back.
Alwyn has generously donated some exclusive treats to the stash of author goodies we have up as perks for donors.
I'm going to Vanna write this as you talk. Go ahead.
No problem. So at the Read for Pixels Rally Up fundraising page. So first off, we have 3 sets of the Rebel of the Sands book bundle. It's signed and personalized UK paperback versions, and it's only for US and UK donors. So within it, there's Rebel of the Sands, Traitor to the Throne, and Hero at the Fall.
These are out of order.
Pretty gorgeous. And secondly, there are three sets of Notorious Virtue sneak peek book bundle, also signed and personalized, and also for US and UK donors only. So you get a special preview of Alwyn's upcoming new book, Notorious Virtue, a hardcover Traitor to the Throne, and a hardcover Hero at the Fall. So, and finally, there's three sets of query letter critiques by Alwyn and everyone all around the world. So this treat is the perfect opportunity for new authors to get some help from Alwyn for query letters very difficult to write at the best of time. And the bundle includes one written critique of your query letter email to you, one written critique of the first three chapters of your work in progress, 50 pages max, one round of up to three follow-up questions via email to Alwyn after the lesson. There are only limited editions to be offered by Alwyn as a thank you for donors, so you better hurry up to donate to get it because it's first come, first serve. And once they're gone, they are gone. So I'd like to thank Alwyn once again. Thank you for joining us. And if you want to say hi to everyone on YouTube, thanks for everyone on YouTube for joining us. I've got a bit more left to say, so we'll say bye to Alwyn there.
Thank you so much. Thanks everyone for joining. Thanks for the great questions and the great conversation. And thanks for running such an awesome charity.
Thank you, Alwyn.
Thanks.
Okay, finally, we'd just like to say please give generously. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. There are also plenty more author goodies available from authors including Sarah Kuhn, Kendari Blake, Diana Renee Heiber, Nikki Drayden, Hilary Monahan, and more. New goodies will be released every Friday throughout September. So please give generously to help us reach our goal. All funds go towards the Pixel Project's work to help end violence against women. So let's screen share with you. Uh, if you can donate to get these goodies on Valleyup at http:/bit.ly/ R4P Valleyup IWD 2020. And if you want to learn more about Read for Pixel, go to http:/bit.ly/Read for Pixel. So to find out more about violence against women and what you can do about it, please